Is things we have to worry about with almost every medical treatment. Is things we have to worry about with almost every diet that we talk about. And what is that? Allergies. What is an allergy and what does it have to do with pathophysiology? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning: the following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy!
Is things we have to worry about when we're doing drug treatments. It's the reason why we have to worry about sending certain foods to school, or why we might not get the peanut that we want on the airplane. It's why some people can't have pets. It's why some people have it's things we have to worry about with almost every medical treatment. It's things we have to worry about with almost every type of diet that we tend to follow. And what is that? Allergies. What is an allergy and what does that have to do with pathophysiology? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning: the following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy!
It's what we have to worry about when we're doing drug treatments, when we're giving vaccines. It's the reason why we have to worry about certain foods that we send to school, or why we might not get the nuts that we might used to have gotten on the airplane. It's why certain people cannot have certain types of pets. It's why every spring or every fall or every winter we might have runny nose, watery eyes, itchy throats. In order to understand allergies, we're able to go ahead and dispel a lot of the myths and misconceptions we have out there as relates to what causes allergies and we have to be concerned about certain types of foods or certain types of environments. But it's also going to allow us to combat a lot of the biases we might see in terms of what can go about in terms of treatments, what can go about in terms of prevention. Allergic reactions is a form of a hypersensitive response within the immunogenic reactions, within our immune responses. When we start looking at this idea about hyperreactivity, what we're really talking about what happens in terms of immunogenicity, in terms of normal activation of the B cells, in terms of normal activation of the T cells. This is where we're going to have some sort of pathogen and some sort of pathogenic antigen triggering an immune response. This immune response will go about doing normal types of immune actions, such as causing B cells to become plasmal, produce antibodies, and antibodies going about doing what the antibody should do, which is labeling the pathogens for removal by the other immune cells. This is where we have distinct types of antibody responses that are going to trigger additional responses than what we should normally have. This is where we're going to have T cell activation that's going to lead to distinct responses within the responses that we see in the immune system that is going to be exaggerated from what is normally occurring to a specific antigen. It is not about having a haywire in terms of immune response. It's instead a response that is abnormal to what we should be getting. This is where we have the pathological responses. It is a pathological response to a pathogenic entity that is causing the allergic responses, that is causing the hypersensitivity. We're going to go through and look at the various types of hypersensitivity that can come about in terms of what is going to lead to the different types of allergic reactions and the different types of responses that we might see based off of those types of hypersensitivity or allergic reactions. So we have this invasion, we have this pathogenic entity that comes in, whether it is something that is foreign, something that is eaten, something that is not supposed to be there, that's going to activate all of our granulocytes. It's going to lead to releases of histamine, releases of prostaglandins, releases of leukotrienes, chemotoxins, platelet activating factors, and heparin. All things are going to change inflammation responses. All things are going to change activation sequences. That type of activation sequence leads to the different types of hypersensitivity or allergic reactions, which is going to be based off the trigger, based off the cell involvement, based on the instigation and resolution, as well as the timing, that is, how long does it last, and when does it start. The first type of hypersensitivity is what's referred to as type 1 hypersensitivity. This is what's referred to as IgE mediated responses. This is our anaphylactic response. This is what we typically think about in terms of an allergic reaction. This is an acute, immediate response to an allergic reaction, to having some sort of allergen or some sort of pathogen that's triggering a hypersensitive response to or within the immune system. So what are the things that are going to do this? Pollen, dust mites, mold, spores, food proteins, insect stings or insect bites. All the things we usually think about are things that are going to cause us to have itches, cause us to have rashes, cause us to have distinct types of allergic reactions that may lead to anaphylaxia in the acute response. How does this come about in terms of the activation sequence? So what ends up happening is that we have some sort of allergen. This allergen is going to lead to what's referred to as a sensitization phase. This sensitization phase is going to lead to the instigation of a T cell activated and B cell activated response, an immunogenic and immunoreactive response, an actual adaptive acquired immune response. That adaptive acquired immune response is going to be triggered by dendritic cells, which is going to cause activation of naive cells, which is going to lead to the activation of the T cells and the B cells, helper T cells, plasmal B cells, which is going to lead to the instigation of the IgE response. That IgE response with subsequent exposure, that is secondary exposure, is going to lead to excessive IgE responses. Those excessive IgE responses is going to lead to excessive release of mediators, histamine, leukotrienes, cytokines, which is going to lead to the hyperreactive responses that we see within allergic reactions. And so what are some of those allergic reactions we're going to see? We're going to see, in terms of acute responses, things like rashes, trouble breathing, face swelling, nausea and vomiting, runny nose, scratchy throat, skin rashes and hives, watery, itchy eyes. All the things we normally think about when we think about having an allergy or allergic reaction. So that is the type 1 type of hypersensitivity. Type 2 hypersensitivity is a cytotoxic mediated response. We're still going to be dealing with immunoglobulins, the antibodies, but we're going to be dealing with T cell activation within this response, where we're going to have some sort of cytotoxic T cell response, which is going to lead to the triggering, which means we're going to have that IL-1, IL-2 response, which will lead to the activation of the B cells, which will lead to the secondary activations that we're going to see within type 2 hypersensitivity. When we start looking at type 2 hypersensitivity, what we're talking about autoimmune diseases. We're talking about blood reactions. We're talking about drug reactions. We're talking about responses to blood transfusions, where we have some sort of an immunological response to those issues affecting us. When we start looking at this activation pathway, what ends up happening is that we have some sort of secondary pathway activation. That secondary pathway activation is going to lead to things like IgM, IgG, IgE activation and linking onto the various types of target cells or various types of pathogenic cells, cells that have been infected. We may get complement protein activation within this type 2 hypersensitivity. The type 2 hypersensitivity from this activation of our neutrophils, activation of our NK cells, activation of our eosinophils, activation of our macrophages, activation of our T cells and our B cells is what's going to lead to release of enzymes, release of piriforms, release of granulosomes, release of secondary toxic substances, which can include lipoprotein saccharides, which can also lead to secondary activation of mast cells, which is going to lead to our hyperreactive responses that we're going to see within the body in this type 2 hypersensitivity response. We start looking at the type 2 hypersensitive response. What are we looking at? We're looking at things like jaundice, fatigue, irritability. You could possibly see some anemia. We could see weight loss. We could see muscle weakness. We could see fatigue. We could see general irritability taking place for the individual. All of these tend to be excessively longer lasting in terms of responsiveness, but can also trigger anaphylaxia if we happen to have an excessive hyperreactive response to the situation. A subset of this type 2 is referred to as type 5. There is a specific type of type 5 that is going to impact our thyroid gland, in particular impact thyroid glands as relates to the onset of Graves' disease, in which we get specific immunoglobulins, IgGs, which is going to lead to activation of the cells within the thyroid. They're going to be producing thyroid hormone, which is going to lead to excessive amounts of thyroid hormone. That excessive amounts of the thyroid, hyperthyroidism, is going to lead to all of the symptoms that we see within Graves' disease. And that's because the antibodies themselves is going to mimic thyroid stimulating hormone in terms of its activation pathway. This is where we have, within that autoimmune effect, we can have a type of hypersensitivity, a type of allergic reaction that's coming into play as relates to the activation of this specific type of hypersensitivity or allergic reaction, and how we can think about some autoimmune diseases as being a subset of allergic reactions in terms of the pathophysiology of those diseases. Type 3 hypersensitivity is an interleukin and complement protein mediated pathway. This is where we have activation of granulocytes, in this case here neutrophils, which is going to activate a complement protein activated immunocomplex response to the allergen, to the pathogen. And so what's happening is we get very similar activation pathways coming into play here. So we have the pathogen coming into play. That pathogen is going to activate the release of IgM, the release of IgG, the release of IgE, but it's also going to cause secondary pathway activation, which is going to lead to complement protein activation. That complement protein activation is going to lead to secondary activations of neutrophils, secondary activation of basophils, secondary activation of the macrophages. All of those are going to release chemicals into the bloodstream, release chemicals into the interstitial fluid, which is going to lead to secondary activations and additional activation of IgM, IgG, IgE, as well as all of the other leukotrienes, interleukins, and secondary complement proteins, which is going to lead to a hyperreactive response to the individual pathogen. This is also something we might see in terms of a cytokine storm response to distinct types of infections. And so what kinds of things are we going to see here? We're going to see autoimmune responses. We're going to see joint swelling and joint pain. We're going to see rash developments. We can see organ damage and failure. We can see changes in blood flow, and we will also see elevated levels of fever. Type 4 hypersensitivity is a cell mediated. So instead of looking at the actual immunoglobulins, the antibodies, as well as the secondary complement proteins come into play, this is all regulated based off of T cells, in particular helper T cells. This is where we're seeing regulation of T cells, or Treg cells, coming into play that's going to have some sort of impact on the responses within the immune cells, leading to hypersensitivity and hyperreactivity within the cells themselves. And so what's happening is that we have activation of our helper T cells, which can lead to activation of macrophages and activations of our killer T cells, or cytotoxic T cells, through interleukin and cytokine signaling. So we're not going to see a whole host of various types of immunoglobulins, antibodies coming into play here. We will still see some IgE, we'll still see some IgG, we may still see some IgM in the type 4 hypersensitivity. However, this is really a Treg response. This is a helper T cell regulated activity, leading to the hypersensitivity and the hypersensitive response. What kinds of things are going to trigger this hypersensitivity? Pollen, pet dander, dust, dust mites, mold spores, certain types of foods, a lot of metals, some poison ivy responses, antibiotic responses, cosmetic responses, responses to detergent, responses to latex. A lot of the contact dermatitis issues that we might see to certain types of detergents, certain types of household cleaners, certain types of PPE products will be triggered by this type 4 hypersensitivity. This type 4 hypersensitivity, based off of what Jill gives us in terms of definitions, gets broken down into about 3 to 5 different types of type 4. Type 4A responses here. When we start looking at the type 4A responses, what's going to end up happening is we're going to get this cascade of events that's going to lead to activation of helper T cells, and the activation of helper T cells is going to lead to activation of secondary dendritic sites, and the secondary dendritic sites is going to trigger all of the atopic changes, the asthmatic changes that we see within the body in response to a type 4 action. In the type 4B response, we're looking more in terms of what's happening on the skin, in terms of this dermatitic response, and this response that we see in terms of activation based off of the allergen triggering that helper T cell activation. The helper T cell activation leading to changes within the immune responses causing that hypersensitivity response, triggering the dermatitis that we might get from contact to something. The type 4C response is going to once again be triggered based off of lymph node activation. This lymph node activation triggering a type of helper T cell, and this type of helper T cell is going to trigger secondary activation. And secondary activation is going to lead to changes within responses in both the respiratory pathway as well as within the skin. A lot of this is going to be triggered to responses of bacteria, responses of fungi, responses of funguses, responses of bacterium trapped within areas of the body. Not necessarily to a allergen that is being released, a chemical is being released from other substances, but is actually the pathogenic entity itself being activated by the neutrophils activating the T cells, which is going to lead to the activation of the dendritic cells. But once again, when we're looking at this type 4 response, we're looking at a helper T cell regulated response as opposed to the other responses that we see in terms of the other types of hypersensitive responses. So what are the things we're going to see in terms of symptoms of type 4 reactions? We're going to see skin irritations. We're going to see skin inflammation. We're going to see rash amounts. We're going to see breathing difficulties. We may see nausea. We may see vomiting. All of this is going to be a long duration response. Not just going to be a long duration response, it's going to take some time to set up. So how does type 4 differ from the type 1, type 2, or type 3, in particular type 1 and type 2? It's the delay in the response. It's the typically chronic adaptations that we're going to see due to the delay in response that we see. A lot of the chronic allergic responses are going to be type 4 responses that we have. A lot of the ability to limit allergic responses is based off of limiting that type 4 response that we see in terms of treatment for allergic responses. Well, thanks for listening. Hope you got a little bit out of this discussion about the pathogeneity of allergic responses. Please make sure you check out more on the podcast as well as within the subsequent discussions that we have as relates to autoimmune responses and other types of pathogenic conditions. Please make sure you're following us here on YouTube as well as on the podcast. Quick takes on Instagram and Threads and the written stuff in Substack.